Duffy. I'm on the faculty of the Jewish Studies Program here at the University of Washington, and I'd like to welcome you all to the 16th Annual Stroum Lecture. It's become customary at introductions to these lectures to recall the reason that we are here, or the cause that brings us here, and that, of course, is the generosity and vision of Sam and Althea Stroum. For it's through these good friends of the Jewish Studies Program that the Stroum Lectures have become a nationally recognized forum for thought on the frontiers of scholarship on the Jews and Judaism. This year our thanks are particularly heartfelt, and we are able to join with the Stroums in celebration of two important moments. First, I'd like to ask you all to join me in welcoming and wishing Sam a happy 70th birthday, celebrated as of April 14th. Most of you probably know that there will be a reception after the lecture this evening across the way in the Walker Ames room. There is also, I'm told, an enormous birthday cake. So you're all invited to help make it a festive occasion. Secondly, just a brief announcement that we would like to congratulate Sam on his appointment recently as President of the Board of Regents. As of March of this year. This is a very important position. And, we're very proud to know you, Sam. I'd like to turn now to the event which the Stroums have made possible, which is, of course, this year's series of lectures by Professor Moshe Idel of Hebrew University on Pardes, the quest for spiritual paradise in Judaism. This is going to be a series of profound lectures and in some degree probably demanding and difficult. And in order to help out, we're circulating a text which will form in some sense the basis of this lecture, a Talmudic text dealing with the theme of Pardes. It's on a little blue sheet constituting the invitation, I think, or the program announcement. Those of you who, I see a number of you have it, but if you don't, you might want to raise your hand, and if there are any extras we can. Dorothy. We'll do our best to circulate them as thoroughly as possible. I'd like to say a few words about Professor Idel by way of orienting us to his work and his theme. Many of you probably know already that Professor Idel's work over the past 10 years has fostered something of a revolution in that area of Jewish studies concerned with the interpretation and history of Kabbalah, or Jewish mysticism. By the 60s and 70s of this century, the historical study of Kabbalah had entered what might be termed a classical phase, with most scholars continuing to extend and refine the pioneering insights of Gershom Scholem into the nature and history of Jewish mystical thought. In the first part of this century, it was Scholem who began to see pattern and structure within the confusing mass of published texts and obscure manuscripts remaining in private, state, and religious libraries, both Christian and Jewish, throughout Europe. It was Scholem who formulated the first coherent typologies of mystical literature in Judaism, discerned patterns of development and influence among the texts, and showed how such developments could be correlated to specific individuals, communities, locations, and historical epochs and events. He brought the science of Judaism to the study of Jewish mysticism. It was Scholem, finally, who turned the study of Jewish mysticism into a respectable academic pursuit. And as the great Shaul Lieberman, the major academic Talmudist of this century, once remarked upon introducing Scholem to an audience, nonsense is nonsense, but the study of nonsense is science. And this is a watchword that we all live by in the world of religious and Jewish studies. Thanks to Scholem, of course, Kabbalah is no longer passed off as nonsense in either the world of Jewish studies or the academic world at large. If this be true, it is thanks to Professor Moshe Idel that we are no longer confined to Scholem's model of how apparent nonsense can be transformed into an inspiring and engaging monument to the imaginative possibilities of the Jewish religious spirit. Idel has inaugurated the post-Scholemian or post-classical phase of Kabbalistic studies. On the basis of his work in reconceiving the origins of Kabbalistic tradition, in identifying new patterns among well-known texts, and in showing how freshly discovered material opens up unanticipated fields of inquiry, Idel has freed his co-workers from writing footnotes to Sholem. He has erected a scholarly structure which he alone cannot entirely exhaust. It will surely engage a generation of scholars, maybe more, who, guided by his intuitions and learning, will be testing, refining, and perhaps challenging the proposals he has put forward regarding the essential structure and historical unfolding of the mystical tradition of Judaism. We're all very lucky to be in on that creative process over the next few evenings. And without further wasting of our time, I'd like to allow you to let me to present Professor Moshe Idel.
Thank you very much for a very generous introduction. I would like to thank the organizer for their kind invitation to this prestigious series of lectures. I shall start with some general observations to the phenomenology of various strata of Jewish religion in order to locate the nature and the role of Pardes legend. One of the most outstanding characteristics of Judaism in its biblical and rabbinic phases is its exoteric nature. It was a religion open equally to the elite and to the vulgus, to the masses. And they were expected to perform exactly the same rituals and to accept the same national myth. The very success of Judaism was envisioned by the classical Jewish text as a dissemination of its contents among all the layers of Jewish nation. In Rabbinic Judaism, the study of Torah was highly regarded as an essential component of Jewish life. These commonplaces seem today to be obvious, but they became less so when we take into account the elitistic nature of some of the ancient religions during the biblical period in the surrounding of the land of Israel, on the one side, and the proliferation of esoteric cults in the Hellenistic world during the Talmudic Midrashic period in the Mediterranean area on the other side. Related to this description of Judaism as an inclusive and exoteric type of religiosity is the non-dangerous nature of Jewish religious life. A biblical verse indicates that you shall live by them, meaning the performing of the commandments. And this performing of the commandment excludes any dangerous situation. The non-escapistic nature of the Jewish ritual, with its emphasis on public rights and the need of a quorum for the performance of some of the most important aspects of its ritual, exclude the possibility of any danger that may stem from following this type of religious life. As such, the biblical and rabbinic forms of Jewish religion are collective and nomian types of life, namely, religiosities focused upon practicing a certain type of nomos, or a law, or the Torah. So I should like simply to summarize what seems to me crucial for the understanding of the essence of the biblical and rabbinic mind, that it is a relatively egalitarian type of religion. It's related to a nomos, to a way of life that is not dangerous, and that's a collective and a public, non-sectarian type of religion. So that's the basic pattern, in my opinion, which characterizes the two first phases of Judaism, the biblical and the classical rabbinic, midrashic, Talmudic Judaism. However, there were also other kinds of religious activities whose nature has little to do with public and exoteric rites of the rabbis. the other different types of rituals were cultivated in smaller circles, which form what is called today the Echalot literature. That's to say, a literature which is mystical in its essence. The drive toward an experience of a direct relation to God, namely a contemplation of the divine stature, was regarded in some circles as attained by the means of non-halachic techniques. These techniques helped the mystic to transcend the common religious experiences in favor of a strong, but at the same time, an extremely dangerous mystical attainment. The ascent of the mystic to the vision of the divine chariot, or the divine seat, or the Merkava, and the vision of the divine body, or divine glory, is the most prominent and articulated form of ancient Jewish mysticism expressed in Hebrew ancient texts. However, the danger, and in many cases the price, paid for such an attainment was very high. Given the great spiritual efforts necessary for the ascent on the high, and even more, the awful encounters between the ascended mystic and the pernicious angels that guard the supernal palaces, the mystical experience was described as a tremendum, an event that is awe-inspiring, less than a delightful happening. Reserved for the very few, the ascent to the divine realm was both an ideal to be attained and, at the same time, a forceful warning against embarking such a mystical adventure. The major text that exemplifies this ambiguity starts with a sentence, 4 sages entered the orchard of the Pardes. That's the text that will preoccupy us. And in this text, we are informed that 3 of the ancient Jewish sages, all of them upright persons, that attempted to visit the Pardes were severely damaged, while only one of them was successful enough to went out in peace. The text we are discussing now is hardly an historical document. It's true that the 4 sages were contemporary, but I do not assume that the text reports one historical event. However, on the other hand, the story may reflect some earlier traditions on the various effects of the entrance in the Pardes. What the Pardes I shall try to discuss later. These traditions were collected and structured in a peculiar manner, which is very important for the understanding of the story. 2 out of the 4 protagonists are portrayed as positive. The first one, Ben Azai, you can look in the version published here. The first one, Ben Azai, died, but nevertheless he is portrayed as being Hasid, or loyal to. The last one, Akiva, emerged safely. So we have 2 protagonists who are basically positive, and 2 others, Ben Zoma, who became mad, and the other one who became a heretic. So it's very simple to see here a certain pattern and organization that points, in my opinion, to the fact that we are not dealing here with some biographical discussions of what happened to Rabbi Akiva or precisely what happened to Ben Azai. But we are speaking here basically with types of experiences and types of effects of this type of experiences, and less with what happened in history to Rabbi Akiva or to any other of the 4 sages who entered the Pardes. That's to say, from the very beginning, the crucial text doesn't deal with some historical event, but with an attempt to exemplify 4 major types of mystical experiences. What is the precise meaning of the story of entering in an orchard depends upon the context where the various versions appear. When occurring in the mystical literature, named the Echalot literature, this incident may point to the dangers which haunt the mystic who strive for a sharp type of mystical experience. When, however, the story occurs in the Talmudic Midrashic sources, like in the text you see here, it could be understood better by assuming that the various types of dangers, as well as the achievements of the successful master, are to be related to their engagement in a variety of mystical speculations, not experiences, speculations, rather than sharp ecstatic events. It would be dangerous and at the same time superfluous to attempt to establish one genuine interpretation of the story beyond the various contexts of its occurrence. The wide spectrum of different interpretations of this story offered in the very rich scholarly studies of the text should serve as a strong warning against indulging in a scholarly proposal for another new proposal of a genuine meaning to all the versions of the text. The core of the Talmudic version of Pardes is a parable whose significance was not explicated. Something very similar to Kafka. The parable, it appears an interpretation of the meaning of an esoteric topic which is also not explicated. To put it in a sharp way, the Pardes is an unexplained parable for an unrevealed secret. This crucial vagueness of both the secret and the parable is extraordinarily important for my discussion. My assumption is that this vagueness, in the case of the Pardes, and the vagueness in general in any type of religious text or religious culture, is a very precious characteristic. It's not a defect, but it's an opportunity for later generation to introduce, if you like, to project new meanings in texts which are open. From this point of view, the Pardes story can be read in the way Umberto Eco proposed to read a good text as an open text. It's very difficult to be explained and allows more than one interpretation. The Pardes, therefore, the orchard of the mystics, is a metaphor for the dangerous zone of religious experience. The orchard, like the paradise, is a guarded garden, the prerogative of the exceptional few, but pernicious for all the others. What happened with the Pardes story is that it was reinterpreted in medieval sources and also in modern sources in a variety of directions. And I'm interested here in the basic patterns of interpretations proposed since the Middle Ages, and I shall limit my lectures only to the Middle Ages, but it can be easily continued up to Renaissance and even later to the Haskalah or to Enlightenment period, when the Pardes became a major symbol for the rebellion against the classical form of Judaism. Here I shall expose four major interpretations. The first one today, the interpretation proposed by Maimonides, a philosophical one. And then the next lecture I shall speak much more about an ecstatic interpretation of the Pardes. And the last lecture I shall discuss two interpretations. One, the Pardes being the realm of the divine Sphirot, and a second interpretation, the Pardes standing for an encounter between the mystic and the demonic world. So we can see a very great variety of interpretations, all of them attempts to penetrate what's the meaning of the Pardes, and it seems to me that the vagueness of the term contributed to the very rich range of interpretations proposed later on. In order to understand the, I would say, common denominator of all the medieval interpretations, we shall have to look a little bit in what happened in Judaism as a religion after the classical period of rabbinic creation, after the Talmud and the Midrash. I propose to see in Jewish culture two major changes. One is the transformation of Judaism from a religion which is exoteric into a religion that's esoteric. That's to say, the religion now is understood by some elite masters as consisting of two basic levels. The exoteric one that's open to the masses, and the esoteric one which is restricted only to the elite. This move is shared by Kabbalah, by the classical forms of Jewish philosophy, not all the forms, but important forms of Jewish philosophy, starting with Ibn Ezra, for example, and much more Maimonides, and later on. And that's also shared by the Hasidei Ashkenaz, another form of medieval Jewish mysticism. That's to say, something happened, and the Jewish elite assumed that Judaism is much more than a religiosity open to everyone. It's still esoteric on a certain level, but it's exoteric on another one. This move from the more communal or collective esoteric religiosity to the more exclusive, elitistic secrets involves an atomization of the collective or the group of the community. The group was still important as a mystical tool in some forms of Kabbalah. But nevertheless, it played a very restricted role in Jewish philosophy and in ecstatic Kabbalah. The individual moves in many of the esoteric groups to the forefront. The personal spiritual achievements, the individual redemption, intellectual perfection are some of the ideals that played the most important role in the variety of Jewish esoteric literature. To understand correctly the secrets, and in some cases to behave while being aware of the spiritual implications of the secrets, and to cultivate this salvific nature, shall discuss in a moment the problem of salvation, are the crucial moments in the life of the members of the Jewish elite in the Middle Ages, Kabbalists and philosophers. This transition from the collective, Judaism as a collective religiosity, to the cult of the individual attainment is an easy one. Elites can hardly avoid it. The esoteric interpretation of Judaism is tantamount in many cases to a reading of the sources as portent of messages that are addressed to the salvation of those few who are able to penetrate, to understand the secrets hidden in the canonic scriptures. This esoteric transformation of Judaism is connected to salvation. In principle, salvation can be attained in two manners: by anticipating the end and by returning to the ideal origin. Speaking as a collective, the Jews could try to hasten the end of history in order to escape its terrors. Active messianism has as its main objective the fate of a collective. But as individuals, the Jewish elite could not expect the change of the course of history for the sake of their personal redemption. As an individual, the spiritual master could attempt to evade the existential and historical pressure by an effort to reach the lost paradise. The paradise, either as a geographical entity or as a spiritual state, exists since the very beginning, and there were only little doubts as to its availability. After all the righteous are generally finding their way to it as soon as they depart from our mundane realm. This is the reason why paradise played a very important role in the understanding of the Pardes. I would like to explain a little bit. Pardes in Hebrew doesn't mean paradise. Pardes is simply a garden, an orchard. But by a series of translations, the Hebrew term paradise, was understood sometimes as Pardes was understood as paradise. But basically, the Hebrew term for paradise is Gan Eden, which was translated by the Septuagint in Greek as paradise. And only later on, some relationship between the idea of Pardes and the idea of paradise occurred. From my point of view, it's very interesting to remark that what happened in rabbinic Judaism and later on in medieval Judaism, the idea of paradise, that is a biblical one, and the idea of the Pardes, that's a rabbinical one, explained each other for a number of reasons. The danger of the biblical paradise and that of the rabbinic Pardes converged, and the lost paradise of the primordial man and the gained Pardes of Rabbi Akiva can explain each other. Both are what I propose to call dangerous ideals or ideal dangers. Each of them explain the other. The Pardes story is the major text, but in my opinion, all the major interpretations of the Pardes story had in mind a subtext, and the subtext was the paradise. The medieval interpretations I shall explore represent attempts to interpret the biblical paradise by the means of the rabbinic Pardes. What was the danger of mentioning the paradise in connection to Pardes? Judaism is a religion based not only on myths of origin, but also on an ongoing ritual. An attempt to escape from the ritual and return to the paradise was dangerous for the major structure of Judaism as a religiosity in medieval period and also in the rabbinic time, and this is why the Jewish master didn't propose the idea of returning to the paradise in an open manner, and they treated the attempt to enter the Pardes, as to say, the dangerous zone, as a very dangerous situation. As to say, Judaism was interested in the form the masters presented it, in a religiosity that's basically non-escapist, which doesn't try to transcend history, but is based on the assumption that the present is crucial, and any attempt to return to the origin, to say to paradise, or the return or the attempt to anticipate the end, messianism, is dangerous for the present state of Judaism, and this is why the idea of Pardes is presented in such a manner. That's an ideal only for the few, very dangerous for most of us. That was done in order to stop any attempts of escapist religiosity which will undermine the classical form of Judaism in rabbinic and medieval forms. I shall start now the discussion of one major interpretation, medieval interpretation of the Pardes story of Moses ben Maimon, better known as Maimonides. He is the founding father of Jewish Aristotelian philosophy and the most important Jewish philosopher in the Middle Ages. I shall try to summarize my conclusions at the beginning and only then to start to enter in some details. For Maimonides, perfect philosophy was the wisdom of the primordial man, Adam. But this primordial wisdom was lost, but nevertheless, it can still be retrieved by some perfect persons, like Rabbi Akiva, and that's the way he understood the entering of the Pardes. To be in the state of paradise, like the primordial man, is to be a philosopher. The paradise is the perfect past, while philosophy is the perfect present, and again, the paradise will be the perfect future. But in any case, we have the assumption of a continuous contemplation, which is the perfect philosophy, and we can explain Maimonides' various discussions of the Pardes in such a manner. The primordial man was a philosopher who was unable to remain in the state of perfect philosophy, and that's the meaning of the fall of man. However, it's possible to, by using the Pardes story, to point to the way to return to the primordial wisdom. And that's what Maimonides tried to do in more than one discussion, to point the way to return to the paradise or to perfect philosophy by analyzing Judaism as a proposal to return to the paradise or to Pardes. So that seems to me the quintessence of Maimonides' proposal of understanding the Pardes story. The Pardes story is a way to point to us the technique to return to the paradise, and also the problems involved in such a return. The basic text of Maimonides, which discusses the idea of the Pardes, occurs in the first part of his major halachic work named Mishneh Torah, where he explains what's the meaning of Pardes. According to him, Pardes is the matter. He doesn't explain openly, because he was a rabbi and he knew that interdicted to explain openly something that's esoteric. So he put it in such a way. The topics connected to the 5 precepts treated in the above 4 chapters, is to say, you must decide what are exactly the topics related to the Pardes. He doesn't mention it. They are related to what our wise men called Pardes. And then he tries to hint something. Despite the fact that those 4 men who entered the Pardes were great men of Israel and great sages, they did not all possess the capacity to know and grasp these subjects clearly. I shall analyze this text. So Maimonides points out what's written in the Talmud. The sages who entered the Pardes were all of them great men of Israel. They were great sages, as to say, not merely practical men, but also sages, chachamim. And nevertheless, they did not all of them, as to say, only one of them, possess the capacity to know and grasp these subjects clearly. To say Pardes is something that's basically related not to a mystical experience, but to a certain type of speculation. So this is why he uses the idea of capacity to know, capacity to grasp, and the capacity to grasp clearly. Yes, according to Maimonides, we have here a problem that's related to the cognitive processes. This is why Maimonides continues to say, it is not proper to walk in the Pardes till one has first filled oneself with bread and meat, by which I mean knowledge of what is permitted and what is forbidden. As to say, according to Maimonides, the entering the Pardes must occur only after rabbinic education. In a moment I shall explain more. As to say, at the beginning you must start with the rabbinic culture to know what's permitted and what not, and only after you reached such a type of knowledge, you may enter in the Pardes. It doesn't mean that you are going to understand. The fact is that most of the people who entered there were great sages and they didn't understand. But nevertheless, the assumption is you need, at the beginning, the rabbinic culture. Why do you need such a culture? For the knowledge of these things, I'm quoting him, gives primarily composure to the mind. In order to be able to grasp the meaning of the Pardes, you must have a certain state of mind. And this state of mind can be achieved by practicing the Jewish law. As to say, for Maimonides, the Jewish law, all the commandments, are a way to achieve a certain stability, a certain type of mastering your lust and your imagination. And only afterwards it will be possible, maybe, to understand something related to the Pardes. As to say, for Maimonides, you can see he is a philosopher. He would like to convince us that the Pardes is a perfect philosophy, which can be achieved basically only by the Jews, because only the Jews has a technique, to say, the commandments, the certain way of life, which will induce you in a certain composure that will enable you to understand. So what's the next stage? According to Maimonides, the Pardes is the apex of philosophy. That is to say, the way he understood Aristotelian physics and Aristotelian metaphysics. To say, for Maimonides, Pardes was interpreted as pointing to the highest achievements of medieval philosophy, which was understood to be the culmination of Judaism. To say, the entrance in the Pardes for Maimonides is the possibility to calm your mind, to master your imagination, to master your lust, in order to be able to study Aristotle. However, that's not a simple Aristotle we assume, that only some two books of Aristotle, the physics and the metaphysics. For Maimonides, there are dangers in understanding the meaning of Pardes and of the physics of metaphysics. Not so simple. There are two major dangers, according to Maimonides. One is the Aristotelian one, the classical one, the cognitive one. Someone who doesn't master his corporeal desires and imagination, someone whose fantasy is very strong, will misunderstand physics and metaphysics. Why? Because our imagination is going to distort reality, and we shall be unable to understand reality. That's physics, because we are going to distort the knowledge. And it's possible to really understand only when your impulses are going to be mastered. This is why the Halakha, or Judaism, proposed a very strict and structured way of life in order to educate, if you like, not only your mind, but your imagination and your corporeal instincts. Because otherwise, what seems to you to be the understanding of philosophy is basically a misunderstanding which is spoiled by your inclinations. And a matter of metaphysics, such a distortion is very dangerous. And there is also another danger, what can be called the Platonic danger. Metaphysics has some political implications, and it will be better, and I cannot elaborate here, it will be better for the masses not to understand some secrets, because they may be harmful for the masses. As to say, the highest part of Aristotelian philosophy was understood by Maimonides as the apex of Judaism, but it's not merely the study of two texts, but is a culmination of a certain way of life which opens the way to a perfect type of philosophy. Not merely repeating what's written in the book Lambda of metaphysics, but to be able to grasp in a perfect manner the content. And that's something that for Maimonides and for many commentators of Aristotle was a very great challenge. Now, the problem is, according to Maimonides, that the four masters who entered the Pardes, according to the story, they were not calm enough, not educated enough to grasp Aristotelian metaphysics. As to say, according to Maimonides, that's something that's truly exceptional, and this is why only one of the four, Rabbi Akiva, was successful enough to come out from his metaphysical speculation safely. Now, this attempt to reach the state of mind of the primordial man can be understood in two manners in Maimonides. One, what can be called the exoteric understanding of Maimonides, will assume that Maimonides assumed that there was an historical person named Adam, and he was a perfect philosopher, and then, because of the inclination, the last desires and fantasy, he failed, and we are now in such a fallen situation. And that's the exoteric reading, based on the assumption that Maimonides uses the Bible in a simplistic manner. If that's the story, then Maimonides is interested in history. It's to say, in what happens then. However, my assumption is that Maimonides has another reading. And the other reading is the esoteric reading. And according to such a reading, the state of the primordial man is always open to anyone, anytime. And at the same time, the sin of Adam is also open to any one of us, anytime. And that's the same in the case of Pardes. Each of us can be Rabbi Akiva, or Ben Azai, or Ben Zoma, or the heretic Elisha ben Acher. As to say, according to such a spiritualistic reading of Maimonides, it's possible to see the Bible, the story of the Pardes, as discussing certain types of experiences, and each of us is able to experience, in principle at least, to experience the experience of the primordial man. I must say that the best interpretation of Maimonides I ever read on this point was written not by an expert of Maimonides, but by a very original writer named Franz Kafka. And I don't see any way to understand Maimonides better than by quoting Kafka. As you know, Kafka wrote a certain type of commentary on the Bible. It's to say, he wrote several passages which, arranged in a certain manner, they run as an interpretation of the Bible, starting with the creation up to the middle of Genesis. And he writes about the expulsion from paradise, that its main significance is that it is eternal. Consequently, the expulsion from paradise is final, and life in this world is irrevocable. But it is eternal, as I said, the expulsion is eternal in nature. We are continuously there in the paradise in actual fact, not matter whether we know it here or not. That's to say, according to such a reading, the paradise of Maimonides and the Pardes of the rabbinical sources will demonstrate not an historical event in the origins, in the case of the Bible, or in the Talmudic period, in the case of the Pardes, but a certain type of experience which is open and depends on each of us. A similar spiritualistic reading of Maimonides I found in one Kabbalistic interpretation of his, authored by a commentator of Maimonides named Avraham Abulafia. And he seems to be the first one who treated the idea of Pardes as being an ongoing experience. And I should like to quote only 2 or 3 sentences from Abulafia, because he seems to me to repeat a little bit earlier than Kafka the same idea, but in a rather more obscure manner. So Avraham Abulafia also understood Maimonides in such a way. And he writes, anyone who enters to the Pardes, anyone, to say, not the 4 sages, anyone who enters the Pardes has to enter in peace and exit in peace. As to say, according to such a reading, the Pardes is not a matter of history. That's something that can be repeated anytime by anyone. And this type of reading, the spiritualistic type of reading, is an attempt to propose a spiritualistic interpretation of the Bible and the Pardes as dealing with types of spiritual phenomena which can be actualized all the time. By such a reading, at least in the case of Abulafia, and also in the case of Kafka, history is not important. Doesn't matter if there was once a person named Adam, or if there was someone named Rabbi Akiva. They don't stand for historical figures. They are types of experiences, and we can, by studying the Bible, the Talmud, by studying also Kabbalah to a certain extent, or philosophy, we became aware not of what happened in a sacred history, but what can happen in the experience of several types of persons. Such a reading seems to me to do justice to several places in Maimonides where he speaks not on Rabbi Akiva, but on people on the rank of Rabbi Akiva. To say, for him, Rabbi Akiva doesn't matter if there was someone named Rabbi Akiva. He is interested in the idea of the rank of Rabbi Akiva. People who are able to reach a certain type of experience. So, according to such a reading, the philosophical one, history disappears. There is no difference between Bible, if you like, and Talmudic religiosity, and there is no difference between them and the Aristotelian philosophy as understood by Maimonides and also by Avraham Abulafia, because according to all of them, the Bible, the Talmud, and philosophy, all of them speak about inner experiences. Inner experiences which are to be related only to the elite because they are dangerous, but they are important to be pointed out in order to live to the masses, or to inject, let us say, in the masses a feeling that in Judaism there is much more than ritualism, and there is a need to try to transcend the ritualistic understanding by pointing to certain forms of spiritual experiences which informed maybe the biblical version of the paradise, the Talmudic version of the Pardes, and maybe Maimonides' version of medieval philosophy. Such a reading I would like to emphasize still assume that ecstatic mysticism or certain forms of philosophy are dangerous. But nevertheless, Judaism tries in this type of interpretation to cope with the problem of the dangerous ideal. as to say, not to simplificate Judaism to a certain type of dry and sober ritualism, but to infuse the idea of the existence of an ideal, which is dangerous, but nevertheless is to be cultivated. It seems to me that this pondering on ideal on one side and danger on the other was a way to balance the rather ritualistic approaches found in non-philosophical and non-Kabbalistic types of Judaism, but on the same time not to allow an explosion of metaphysical speculations or Kabbalistical, theosophical speculations which may endanger the observance of the ritual. As to say, the idea of the Pardes in Maimonides, in the way I am understanding it, can be summarized as an attempt not merely to propose philosophy, because what I summarized in the last 2 minutes is not Aristotle, but to use Aristotelian psychology and Aristotelian metaphysics in order to point to a certain type of very complex meditations, if you like, on the meaning of the secret Judaism, the Pardes, and in such a way, Judaism introduced by Maimonides a new paradigm of understanding Judaism, that's to say the Aristotelian one, which was appropriated by the means of what Pardes is. To say Pardes is now a certain type of philosophical interpretation of Judaism. And by opening such a paradigm, Maimonides was able to start a whole range of interpretations of Judaism in 13th and 14th century, basically up to the 18th century, when many of the Jewish philosophers interpreted the Pardes in the way Maimonides proposed. That's to say, at the beginning, in the starting point, the ritualistic Judaism, which is able to guide us to a higher form of spiritual life, which is introduced by necessity by the ritual. So these two directions, one to fortify, if you like, the ritual, and the second one to show to you the ritual is not the final attainment. That seems to me the major problem in this type of interpretation. You need the ritual, and at the same time you must transcend it. But this transcendence of the ritual is impossible but by the very few. But for the very few, you need another ideal that's higher than the ritual, and that's the Pardes. That's something that attracts, fascinates, but nevertheless, it must be limited. Next time, I shall speak about another type of interpretation, where the center will be not speculation and not an interpretation of Judaism in Aristotelian terms, but the problem of the ecstatic experience. As to say, mystics for whom the Pardes is not a type of philosophy, but an encounter with a terrible type of light, and that's the primordial light. Thank you very much.